The Center for Critical Thinking and Moral Critique, in concert with Sonoma State University, is proud to present videotape proceedings of the International Conference on Critical Thinking and Educational Reform.
Thank you very much. This session, as you know, is opening up a series, and it's a series that deals with teaching, but starts with the challenge which faces us, and that is, how do we, while we're in the midst of teaching our various courses at whatever level we're teaching at, how do we effect a paradigm shift? How do we begin to transform our instruction and the way that we design it so that our practice is part of what is shifting a paradigm almost 180 degrees? This is a challenge that many of us have been facing for quite a number of years, so it isn't as if it's an impossible circumstance, but I think it does entail that one continues to work under difficult conditions and with some frustrations that hopefully in the future will not be there for teachers and professors who follow us. For example, now, as you begin to demand of students, require of students that they reason, students become frustrated, somewhat confused at the beginning of things because they're not used to it. As one of my frustrated students said to me in a moment of exasperation, "I don't like this kind of thinking. We don't use it in any of my other courses." And with that, if I put myself empathically into the thinking of the student, then this student is perceiving this class which I'm teaching as some eccentric class taught by this very strange person who is asking him to do something that he has never done before, which doesn't make complete sense to them and which is very frustrating and difficult. And this, I think, we have to accept as part of what comes with the turf. We also have to expect that with a paradigm shift, different people will be at different places. Some people will dig in their heels. They won't budge 1 inch out of an old paradigm. And the paradigm will shift in part only because they retire at a certain point in time and they're gone. But while they're there, they're going to fight against it because they're comfortable, satisfied, and deeply involved in a paradigm, so much so that it isn't a paradigm to them, it's reality. You can see something as a paradigm only if you can see another paradigm. You can see a perception as a perception only if you can see an alternative perception. And for many people, it is not a question of shifting a paradigm. It's a question of either accepting reality, which is their view of things, or missing reality, which is any other view of things. But they don't see in their own practice one of more than one options. And there are other reasons as well, which I won't elaborate upon, but I think you see the thrust of it. I want to begin this then, first of all, with a sense, a kind of historical sense of what critical thinking is about. And I want to begin by admitting and pointing out to you that critical thinking is not something new. In fact, on the left-hand side, you can see two words, critical and logic, that both have Greek roots. And on the right-hand side are two words, think and reason, that have Latin roots. And I want to talk just for a moment with you about these roots. The Latin root is tangere, which, according to my dictionary, originally meant something like to know. And so there is in the root of thinking the notion that when we think we know, or thinking is the attempt to know. On the other hand, if we take the Greek root of critical, we find kritikos and criterion in Greece. And kritikos, according to the dictionary, has to do with judging, discerning, having judgment. And criterion has to do with standards and testing. And so if we took just that, we would say, etymologically, critical thinking is thinking which seeks to know by judging with discernment, using standards and tests as a means. And just going this far suggests that in the roots of these words is a very old concept. And we can go a little bit further here because we can take logic and reason, and we find that logic comes from a Greek word logikos, and reason from a Latin word ratio, and both of them meant essentially the same thing, to figure out. To figure out. So that you could say the purpose of logic is to figure something out, and the purpose of reason is to figure something out. Now, both of these words, logic and reason, or logikos and ratio, come from two Indo-European roots. That is, both languages have a common language in the background. In the background, the etymology of logikos goes back to skiri. I don't know if that's properly pronounced, probably not, which means to cut and separate and divide, also to sort. And the root re, according to my dictionary, means to combine, to gather, to synthesize. And so you might say, etymologically, you have one half in the Greek. The Greeks are on the analytic side, and the Latins are on the synthetic side. But each of those roots, then, sheds some light on the nature of what this thinking is doing when it is trying to know. It is trying to reason logically, to use standards and tests to figure out. And if you put all of these together, I think you come pretty close to a reasonable concept of what we now mean by critical thinking. And in that sense, this is nothing new. But in my presentation and in the way I'm approaching this, I'm putting the concept of logic right at the center. And I'm using it in this way, the logic of. Notice the presentation is how to teach students to seek the logic of things. The logic of things. Think for a minute of things, not of our conceptions of things. The logic of the screwdriver, the logic of parenting, the logic of being a child in Chicago in the 30s, the logic of the Depression, the logic of this poem, the logic of the experiment, each of these expressions, though it might strike you as slightly odd, also comes across as somewhat intuitive. And the reason for that is, if you look up the word logic in the dictionary, so the Oxford English Dictionary especially, you'll see there's a family of related meanings, and underneath these meanings is the notion that everything is logical, can be made logical, or can be assessed through logic. Start with this notion. All we know are ideas. If somehow or another you could strip somebody's ideas away completely, so that they had no ideas whatsoever, presumably they would have no knowledge, nor would they have any experience left. Because we don't experience as humans separate from our ideas. We don't experience a shape undifferentiated. We experience a tree or a cat. You're here experiencing this room, and you're experiencing heat, and you're experiencing lights, and you're experiencing a stage and a person, and this represents a certain meaning in your mind, and you can't experience it with none of those going on, as far as I know. At least I can't. But if all we know are ideas, then we have to notice also that these ideas always work in systems. That is, it is the characteristic of an idea that no idea stands alone. And that to understand any one idea, you have to understand other ideas as well. So if you have to understand what parenting is, then you have to have at least the idea of a child, the idea of birth, the idea of youth, the idea of responsibility, the idea of danger, the idea of nurturing, the idea of, well, many, many other ideas. You simply can't understand the one idea all by itself. It needs the other ideas. Its logic is a part of a bigger system of meanings. So we can go one step further. All we know are ideas which work in systems with logical interrelations. Two ideas are important here. One is the notion of interrelationships, and the other is logical interrelationships. That is, the relationship between parent, the concept of a parent, and the concept of a child isn't an arbitrary relationship. It's a reciprocal relationship. There's something logical about this relationship. It isn't arbitrary. It isn't haphazard. If we had the concept of the child, we understood the child, we would need the concept of the parent. It's only logical. It is implied. You might say that parents are implied in children, or something parental, something guiding, something nurturing, something protecting. So, what else? This. All we know are ideas which work in systems with logical interrelations requiring some level of intellectual discipline. Why? Because if the ideas are logically related to each other, then you could make a mistake about their connections. If they have no logic to them, if they're just BBs in a bag, well, you can arrange them any way you want. You are not constrained. You are not required to respect what is inherent in them. And if you grant that intellectual discipline is involved, then you will find that you cannot escape without presupposing intellectual criteria and standards. Now, this is a fundamental idea, then, that what we know is logical. It's connected with ideas. These ideas are interrelated, and they presuppose the capacity to assess and to judge. Now let me get at that idea. I don't know how intuitive it may be to you at the moment, but let me give you a couple of examples which I wrote down earlier. And this is meant simply to stimulate your intuition. You miss the logic of dancing if you think all you need to be able to do is put your feet in the right places on a diagram. You miss the logic of driving if you think all you have to do is obey traffic signals. You miss the logic of love if you think people you love must always agree with you. You miss the logic of experience if you think that point of view does not play a role. You miss the logic of tennis if you think it's just people hitting a ball up and back in a box. You miss the logic of chess if you think it's just people pushing figures on colored squares. You miss the logic of curriculum if you think it's just a matter of listing things that would be good to know. You miss the logic of teaching and learning if you say, any questions? No, good, then we can go on. And you miss the logic of memory if you think rote achieves it. Now, I'm not concerned with the correctness of those judgments, but the way in which each one attempts to show that there is such a thing as to get the logic of it and such a thing as to miss the logic of it. And that what we attempt to understand and know, in fact, has a logic. Look at this diagram for a moment. Take a very simple idea, the idea of a dog. We've all experienced a dog. Very simple idea. You'd think, well, you just look and now you know what a dog is. But actually, the concept of a dog is quite complicated. There are many ideas involved in the logic of a dog, what a dog is. For example, if it's a dog, then it will bark rather than mew. And we know that. It will wag its tail when pleased. It will growl when irritated. It will be unable to fly. It will have paws rather than feet. And it will be carnivorous. Now, these are all implied in my concept of a dog, and many, many other things as well. So much that we could spend the rest of the day simply deducing what follows from the expression, this is a dog. And so again, this makes the point that to know anything is to know a system of ideas. Now, I want to diverge just a little bit here and ask you to reflect with me on this question. Is this the way students look at it? And I think fundamentally not. I think fundamentally students think that there are bits and pieces of knowledge, that you can pick them up independent of each other, and that if you remember what was said in the textbook, then you know something, and that something pretty much stands by itself. In fact, Bloom's taxonomy, if you're familiar with that, encourages that by calling recall knowledge. If you know Bloom's taxonomy, it says the first level of learning is knowledge, and then after that comes comprehension. So presumably you could know something you didn't understand, that you couldn't imply, that you couldn't analyze, that you couldn't synthesize, that you couldn't evaluate, but you could still know it. This is wrong. Bloom has mistook the knowledge, the logic of knowledge for the logic of recall. That is, he's put knowledge in place of recall, because if you read closely what is said, you'll see that what is being talked about is nothing other than recall. And I put it to you, recall is not knowledge. or if it is knowledge, it is a very, very low level of knowledge. Now, what happens when students begin to get the idea that knowledge, when you have it, gives you logical implications? Students will begin to be able to reason in ways like this, although I'm not necessarily saying this is good reasoning. There could be flaws in this reasoning, but what it shows is a mind that is sensitive to logical implications and connections. This is a wooden table. The child sees that the table is wooden and then says, therefore there are trees. That's what this little sign means. And if there are trees, there must be sunlight. And if there is sunlight, there must be stars. And if there are stars, there must be a solar system. Therefore, if there is at least one wooden table, there must be at least one solar system. Now, I'll put it to you that very rarely do you hear students doing anything like this. In fact, rarely do you ever hear them use the word therefore. That is, thinking, looking for logical connections is not what students presently are doing. And so what we want to do is to give them this paradigm. Give them the sense that all we know is interconnected with everything else we know. And if you begin to understand one thing well, you're on your way to understanding many, many other things. There is a poem by, is it Tennyson or Browning? Flower in the Crannied Wall? Tennyson? It goes something like this. Flower in the crannied wall, I pluck thee out of thy crannies. If I could understand thee, root and all in all, I should understand what God and man is. Poem ends. And the idea is, if you can understand one thing thoroughly, you would understand everything. Or to put it, go back to the concept of a dog. To understand a dog, you end up having to understand biology and medicine and evolution, and the circles, if you keep following them, burgeon outward in many directions. We want students to be able to have this insight. Give me ideas. Give me any ideas. And with those ideas, I can do the following thing. I can make statements and I can ask questions. Give me statements and questions, and I can seek reasons and evidence to determine whether those statements are correct or incorrect, justified or not justified, answerable or not answerable. Give me reasons and evidence, and I can begin to assess them to determine whether they're acceptable or not. Therefore, give me some ideas, and I can begin to explore the nature of things. That is, they begin to see that ideas are tools for understanding things. Ideas can be used to pose questions. They can be used to figure things out and to be checked out at the same time. So how does this then interrelate with the disciplines? Well, we take the various disciplines and we split them into two words. Most of them submit to this. And we get from biology, biologic, the logic of living things. Assumption, there is a system of relationships that exist in living things. This system of relationships could be understood. And when it is understood, it is a logical system. Everything fits together. Everything makes sense. everything is coherent and it can be tested. From sociology, we get sociologic, which implies that there is a system of ideas that can be used to make sense of the actual system of relationships that do exist in societies, and once again, that there is a logic to social life. And so, psychologic. In the 19th century, people who we would now classify as mentally disturbed were considered crazy, not in the sense of sick, but in the sense of unintelligible. And we still use the word sometimes in that sense. That's crazy. That doesn't make any sense. But then, as psychologists began to take it seriously as a logic, as a system that did make sense, they tried to figure out the logic of pathologic. What's the logic of this disturbance? What's the logic of that disturbance? Don't tell me it's just crazy and weird and unintelligible. What's the assumption? It must be intelligible. There must be a way to make sense of it. There must be some system of ideas which we can develop, which will shed light on the nature of pathologic. And in fact, the word itself, pathologic, the logic of sickness or disturbance. And then finally, anthropology, which assumes there is a logic to the evolution of human life. And this logic is so developed today that we have a system of ideas such that give an anthropologist just one bone, and very often she can deduce a whole culture. Give you a time period, put a skeleton, put flesh on the skeleton, and make all kinds of deductions about the conditions that must have existed, both socially and physically, because of this one bone. All of this is due to the power of the logic of ideas when disciplined by persons who are willing to restrain their minds and work in an organized, systematic way. This then implies, and this is where critical thinking comes in, that there are multiple logics in the world, and we can understand them. We can figure them out if we put our minds to it. Today, earlier, I talked about media logic and the way that particular logic functions. Some people don't think about that logic, don't think about the way the media is imposing a new system of relationships upon us. Do not see how those relationships can be taken apart and understood. And here's another logic, the logic of a personal viewpoint. You meet a person, what makes them tick? Recently, I've been reading the short stories of Somerset Maugham, who wrote in the 30s, I think in the 20s of this century. And he explores the mind of individuals. He's continually trying to make sense of how particular individuals see the world. And of course, many novelists do this, many dramatists do this. And we see then, or try to see, the logic of this person's mind. Or take Death of a Salesman and Willy Loman, the logic of that mind, the way that mind thinks, the kinds of assumptions it makes about the world. And so then you see Willy Loman not as just a bunch of discrete facts, but as a whole integrated world, a whole way of thinking about things. And if you understand the character, you can reason the way Willy Loman reasons. You can see as Willy Loman sees. You can assume what he assumes. You can deduce what he deduces. Economic logic. Here is the basic concept that underlies economic logic. And it's given in a question. Who gets what, when, and how? If you understand that question, and you follow out the logic of that question, you end up with the whole of economics. Because it all pours out of that one question, that one interest. Who gets what, when, and how? And, of course, then different people come up with systems for deciding who gets what, when, and how, and we get different economic systems which have a different logic. And we try to decide which logic better fits the real logic, economics as it is outside of our thinking. The logic of the news. Think of that for a moment. What is the logic of the news? Let me give you some fragments of that logic and see if you see how, if you understand this, this transforms your sense of what is going on in the news. Can you, in the news, tell us everything that is new that happened yesterday? Well, first of all, you immediately notice new to whom? New in what way? And if you think about how many events happened yesterday in the world, billions of events happened yesterday. So what must happen in the news? Well, somebody's got to decide what to include and what to exclude. Well, how much is included and how much is excluded? Well, 99 and 44 or 99.999999% is excluded, and 0.000001% is included. Can you do this scientifically without making any value judgments? Of course not. You'd have to decide what was significant. Well, who decides? And soon we see that the news, and here's the logic, is always news according to a point of view. Question of a critical thinker, whose point of view? Then it begins to get interesting. But lots of people think of the news as just a phenomenon, a fact, like the rain. As if the news didn't have a logic, its own logic, and a logic which means that in a democracy or a country that aspires to democracy, we want to watch that logic. Because the person controlling what is the news controls how we see the world, and who controls how we see the world controls us, because we have to judge reality not just in terms of what we immediately experience, but a much broader picture of things. Now, let me get from there to instruction. There are three logics that are very important for us as teachers. The first logic is the logic of reasoning in general. That is, if you don't know what reasoning is, you can't cultivate it. And most people are not clear about what reasoning is. They don't know what the parts of reasoning are. They don't know how to examine reasoning, to check it out, to see if it's good reasoning or weak reasoning. Yes, we all have some intuitions. We all notice that some reasoning doesn't make sense or doesn't make sense to us. And some reasoning sounds pretty good. The problem is, some reasoning that sounds very good is very bad, and some reasoning that sounds bad is actually very good, if you understand reasoning. For example, psychologic often seeps in. And psychologic says this: if it agrees with me, it makes sense, and it's true. If it disagrees with me, it's false. So now I give you a line of reasoning, and it ends up with a conclusion that you don't believe. You say, that's bad reasoning. That's psychologic. That's not logic. That's not reasoning. That's reasoning controlled by your psychology. And it's very easy for the mind to be controlled by something other than what it thinks is controlling it. And of course, that circles back to critical thinking, because in critical thinking, we're trying to take charge of our minds, to be ourselves the determining factor of what shapes our mind. And that means, of course, that we have to understand the logic of what is shaping us and then decide whether we're going to intervene and reshape ourselves in one way or another, or whether we're going to accept that shaping because, upon reflection, we approve of it. So this is one very important variable, the logic of reasoning, and it's a problem. The second is the logic of the content. Absolutely essential. That is, if we're teaching history, we have to understand the logic of history. Not in all its details, but we have to basically understand it. Many teachers don't understand the logic of the subject they teach because they learned it as a bunch of individual independent things that are true or false, and the field tells you it, but they can't think their way through it. They can't identify the basic assumptions, the fundamental questions, the kind of reasoning that's involved. For example, go back for a moment. I mentioned the logic of the news. The logic of the news is almost identical to the logic of history. It's just a kind of mini version of the logic of history. And the logic of history is very similar to the logic of gossip. When you think about it, it's somebody's story about what happened. And when that story is justified, it's good historical thinking. And when it's not justified, it's bad historical thinking. And when it's just everyday history about people we know done in a fairly slapdash fashion, it's gossip. Now, what does this tell you? If you understand the logic of history, you understand that whenever you read a history book, you say, what didn't get included? What was the purpose of writing this history book? What point of view is shaping this? Where are the conclusions and where is the data to support these conclusions? You have to read it this way because that's the only way you could look at the logic of it. And since you learn through the logic of something, that's what you're looking for. Now, mostly students and teachers miss this because they think of history as remembering what the history book said. But what is in the history book viewed in terms of the logic of history? Fundamentally, it's the conclusions that somebody else came to when they thought historically. Now, how do we know whether to accept conclusions that somebody came to when they thought historically or mathematically or scientifically or any other way? Well, we have to see more than their conclusions. It's not enough to see their conclusions. You don't learn much from a conclusion. You learn a lot from seeing how you get to a conclusion, because then you can consider an alternative way to get to that conclusion, or maybe to a different conclusion. You can begin to see its logic. You can begin to see whether the logic it presents makes sense or doesn't make sense. But this is not the way history is taught, typically. Then the third variable, the logic of the student's thinking. This is the third essential logic in this logical trinity that the classroom represents. Because if the student is going to learn anything, there's only one thinking that student can use, and that's their own thinking. You learn, and we know this from empirical studies of learning, that whatever you learn, whatever new logic you learn it on the basis of a logic you already know. You take that old logic and you adapt it. And sort of, you could put it this way, you always need scaffolding. And you get scaffolding from what you already have. If you have nothing, you can get nothing from it. And so, in teaching, we could fail to understand reasoning and therefore not assign reasoning. We could fail to understand the logic of our subject and therefore not get the students into the logic of the subject. Or we could fail to respect the logic of student thinking, and so even though we were aware of both of these, we would be beyond our students. That is, we would do what we call snow the student. And so though our own thinking might be very logical, we may be reasoning very well, and we may be reasoning very well within the logic of the subject and discussing it and all the rest of it, but it is not touching base with the logic of the student thinking, and therefore it draws a blank. You see this in many subjects. You see it especially, for example, in the subject which I taught for many years, which is philosophy, in that very typically in an introductory philosophy course, you throw students right into the middle of the most abstract, advanced philosophical thinking, and you expect them to understand it. This is the educational equivalent of putting a junior high school kid into the ring with a first-rate professional boxer and say, have at 'em. There's no contest. It's a slaughter. The student can't internalize it. Therefore, the student retreats to memorization. Just tries to repeat back what somebody said, is very frustrated, and as a result, students tend to hate philosophy. And very often, philosophy professors are puzzled as to why they hate philosophy. When, if you recognize that the logic of the student's thinking, the logic of the student's experience is not successfully engaged, then you understand what the problem is. So, what do we have to do? Here's one way that we can look at it. We have to try to introduce the logic of the content into the logic of the student's thinking through reading, writing, speaking, and listening. Read the logic, write the logic, speak the logic, hear the logic. That is, you can't get logic in through the manipulation of your arms. It requires the manipulation of your mind. It requires that your mind reason. Now, there are 4 common modes of reasoning in the schools: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. But what is the problem? Students don't get the logic of reading. They don't get the logic of writing. They don't get the logic of speaking, and they don't get the logic of listening. That is, they think that the logic of listening is sitting passively waiting for something to happen in the head. And you do not learn through listening through that process. For listening to be effective, it must be active, and it must involve reasoning. So somebody says something to you, and you're a good listener, that is, you understand how to listen well. You say, oh, what is your point? Or what's the purpose of this? Oh, I see. So that's the purpose. Okay, go ahead. I'm following you. Yeah, okay, but now stop here for a minute. Is this the problem or is that the problem? Oh, neither of those? Oh, okay, then I need an explanation. Person explains. Okay, fine, go on. Oh, wait a minute. Could you elaborate a little more on that? I don't think I understand that. Or stop for a moment. I think I have this. Let me tell you what I hear you saying. Do I hear you correctly? Now, sometimes, as a listener, we have an opportunity to do that face on. But here's how most people listen. Face on. Yeah. No. I disagree with that. I agree with that. I disagree with that. Now, none of that is interactive. None of that is the active listener. This person is not trying to reason through the logic of your thinking. They're not trying to figure it out. They're not trying to get into the logic of it. Because, you see, when you're speaking, you're translating the logic of your experience into the logic of language, which is a difficult thing to do. Speaking isn't easy to do it well. And on the other hand, the listener has a much harder thing, because they have to take your words and translate it into their logic through their experience. That's a very challenging thing to have to do. And therefore, we give students no training in it whatsoever. We just tell them, listen up, pay attention, and then allow them to go to sleep. We don't give them the training whereby they would understand how to reason as they listened. If we're going to have children and students spending about 90% of their time in class listening, then we have to teach them how to listen actively. By the way, as far as I can see, listening, the logic of listening, the skills that are involved in listening are the hardest of the four. Once you start to write, for example, it's very hard not to learn things when you try to express it in your own words and explain it in writing. That's why writing is such a powerful tool of learning. But it's very easy to have this feeling when you're listening. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, okay, fine. Yeah. Okay, then explain back to me what I said. Gee, I haven't the foggiest idea. I know it sounded good, but no, I can't explain it back to you. It's very easy. And you see that, of course, also in reading, where sometimes we'll discover for the last 10 pages we weren't reading. We were just going over the words. We thought we were reading at the moment, but suddenly we discover, no, our mind wasn't engaged. There are specific skills of reading, and they are reasoning skills. There are specific skills of writing, and they are reasoning skills. There are specific skills of speaking, and they are reasoning skills. For example, in speaking, figure out the logic of your audience, the logic of your thinking, the logic of my subject, and the logic of the reasoning I want to present to you in a form that you can maximally translate and make meaningful into your experience. And so, in each of these cases, then, we take what are taken as very often lower order skills, reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and we recognize that we need a higher order variety of them. And we recognize, then, to do that, we have to make this prominent in the classroom. So, what do we have to do? First of all, reasoning, the word reasoning and all that is associated with it must become part of the vocabulary of everyday classroom discussion. What is the basic vocabulary that is associated with it? Let me mention it. There are 9 parts to reasoning. That is, whenever you're reasoning, it doesn't matter what you're reasoning about. You can be reasoning about a wart on your hand, your whole marriage, God in the heavens, or a flea in the soil. It'll have 9 parts. You'll be reasoning for a purpose. You'll be trying to solve a problem, at least one. You'll be using information that you got from somewhere. You'll be interpreting that information using concepts and ideas. You'll be coming to some conclusions. Those conclusions will have implications. Your conclusions will be based upon assumptions that you're making. You will reason within a point of view, whether you recognize it or not. And in your own mind, you'll have what you take to be justifications for your conclusions. Why the conclusions seem right to you. Therefore, whenever anyone is reasoning about anything, we can say, what's your purpose? What was the problem? Where are you getting your information? How are you interpreting that information? What conclusions are you coming to? What are you basing those conclusions on? If these conclusions are correct, what are the implications and consequences of this if we put this into action? From what point of view did you approach this? And so forth. And it doesn't matter what you're reasoning about. 9 isn't such a large number. We could teach students these 9 features of reasoning. They could pick them out in their history courses, in their math courses. They could pick it out even when talking about Goldilocks and the 3 bears. What evidence did Goldilocks have? Where did she get her information about what was inside the house? Pay close attention to the story. Let's see if we can figure that out. What problem was she facing? What was her purpose? What was she trying to... Why was she out in that forest anyway? Did she take something for granted here? What do you kids think? And the kids can answer. They can reason. They're already reasoning in little ways. It's just that we do nothing to bring it out into the open. We keep it in the background. And so the challenge to us then, if you accept this model, is to bring the logic of reasoning into the classroom, the logic of the content into the classroom, the logic of student thinking into the classroom, and get the students to read the logic, write the logic, speak the logic, hear the logic, take it apart, put it together, take it apart, put it together, and continually be involved in the act of figuring things out. Figuring out their thinking, figuring out the text, figuring out the implications of this statement, figuring out what point of view is appropriate, figuring out where this author got his information. And so the challenge to us is to take this model in the classroom and make it concrete and real and practical. It's eminently practical. It has the practicality of a powerful, highly generalizable truth that is used implicitly by all thinkers and has been used by thinkers for generations. But here's the thing, it does require discipline. It does involve pain and suffering and confusion because that's part of learning. But out of that comes the most magnificent thing you can imagine, a fit mind. A mind in good condition. A mind that has discipline, not a body. And the Romans had a saying, mens sano in corpore sano. A sound mind in a sound body. We got half of it right. We're going for the sound body. Now we need to discover the other, a sound mind. Thank you very much.